The story of Susan Walsh is wrapped up in the whisperings of vampire cults, conspiracies, and connections to a possible hit on her life. The details surrounding Susan's disappearance are pretty much a mystery. Not much is known about what happened on the day and where Susan is now, but that doesn't mean there aren't plenty of theories out there. One July day in 1996 turned the lives of the Young and Walsh families upside down and left internet sleuths on a 30-year hunt for the truth. Susan Walsh was born to Martha Young and Floyd Merchant in Wayne, New Jersey on February 18, 1960. Unfortunately, Susan's childhood was far from picture perfect, and the trauma she suffered in her youth carried over well into her adulthood, as it so often does. Young Susan dreamed of becoming a writer and a poet, and spent most of her time fiercely scribbling down ideas and dreaming up imaginary worlds in her head. It's likely that poetry and writing were an escape for Susan and provided her with an outlet to express her feelings. Despite all these setbacks and hurdles, Susan enrolled herself at William Patterson University to study English and writing. The college lifestyle quickly swept Susan under, and this is where her problems with drugs and alcohol began. To help herself through college, and to help support her addictions, Susan worked as an exotic dancer, scurrying away the tips to pay for her tuition. She would later tell a friend and filmmaker, Jill Morley, that dancing had taken a tremendous toll on her physical and mental health. The industry had fueled her addiction, and she had become trapped in a vicious cycle of having to dance for quick and easy money to fund her habits. By 1984, Susan had graduated from William Patterson University, and things appeared to be on the up for her. While at college, she had written for the university's newspaper, and the future seemed bright. After graduating from college, Susan got sober, married her husband, Mark Walsh, and the two welcomed a son, David, into the world in 1985. In just a matter of years, Susan had turned her life around. However, just as quickly as success had come, it would slowly slip out of her hands. Mark and Susan separated, and by the early 1990s, Susan found herself dancing once again to support herself and her son David. Susan and her son lived in an apartment building in Nutley, New Jersey, with Mark living in the adjoining basement apartment below, making custody and childcare a bit easier for a struggling single mother. It was also at this time that Susan began to slip back into her old ways, turning to drugs and alcohol to soothe her through the pain. Susan's life was filled with ups and downs, and just as her life seemed to be falling away from her, a piece of good news was headed her way. She had secured herself an internship at the New York City newspaper, The Village Voice, which helped her revitalize her journalism career. Now, Susan could leave the world of dancing behind once more and focus on her career and her beloved son. Her family would later say that Susan was a devoted mother who did whatever she could to get by and to provide David with a better life. While working for the Village Voice, Susan was tasked with investigating the sex industry, something she had a lot of first-hand knowledge about. In one article, Susan uncovered a Russian organized crime group that had allegedly been forcing young Russian women to work at clubs. These women had little choice in the matter and were said to be treated like slaves. Their only purpose was to work and to earn money for the gang. This piece was a hit, at least in the journalistic world. Susan was finally getting the recognition she deserved and craved, but it wasn't all good attention. Her article had apparently caught the attention of the Russian mafia, the same group that Susan had written about in the article. After the article was published, Susan's friends reported that she had become increasingly paranoid, telling them that she was being stalked and that there were even hits out on her life. This paranoia coincides with the fact that Susan had regularly stopped taking her medication for bipolar disorder and was known to be abusing substances. These combined can create a deadly combination in the mind of someone who is unwell. With Susan's article a hit, she moved on to another dangerous group operating in New York City at the time. But this time, it wasn't the sex industry, but vampires. These vampire clubs proclaimed that they had a large client base of real blood drinkers, and the entire mood and atmosphere around these clubs was incredibly mysterious and exclusive. Susan even dated a guy who was in the vampire club scene and latched onto the idea of blood drinking clubs operating in New York. According to fellow journalist James Ridgway, she believed a lot of things that these guys were telling her about how they were secret murderers and so on and so forth in the vampire world. She wouldn't say to me, I met these two guys and they got in this van and it's very scary and I don't know whether I should go into their van. So I said, hey, look, don't go in the van because they might not be vampires. You don't know. Susan threw herself into this vampire cult project, but the Village Voice didn't see her vision as clearly as she did. The newspaper chose not to run the article due to the lack of concrete facts and the objectivity of the article, which was a huge disappointment to Susan. Susan swung between journalism and dancing, but by the summer of 1996, things once again started to look up for her. She had recently completed the primary research for an upcoming book by James Ridgway and Sylvia Platsche titled Red Light: Inside the Sex Industry. It was also around this time that Susan spoke to filmmaker Jill Morley about her time in the sex work industry as part of the documentary Jill was working on. Susan told Jill, "It's draining me. I've been in it 4.5 years. 4 years too long, I'd say, and I'm stuck in this conundrum because I feel so drained and I'm damaged right now. I will admit that. Very damaged from the business. I'm hurting very bad." Jill would also add to this, telling Unsolved Mysteries, Susan said she had bronchitis, emphysema, and an ulcer. She said she had been to the hospital twice that week. She talked about her mood swings and being depressed and just about holding on to life. James Ridgway also told investigators that in the days before Susan disappeared, she had turned up to the publishing company office with bandages around her wrists. Susan had been harming herself again, and later admitted to James that she was taking Xanax and drinking again. She promised him that she would get professional help if she needed it. It was clear to everyone around her that her mental health was ailing, along with her physical health, but before they could intervene, she mysteriously disappeared. On July 16, 1996, just days after she had given her interview to Jill Morley, Susan stepped out of her apartment on Washington Street in Nutley, New Jersey, for what would be the last time. She sent David to his father's apartment and told Mark, her estranged husband, that she would be back in 30 minutes, as she was going to run some errands and use the payphone across the street. 30 minutes had passed, and there was no sign of Susan. Soon an hour had gone by. As the hour ticked on, Mark's worry began to grow, and he called the Nutley Police Department to report his estranged wife missing. Soon, police launched an investigation at the apartment building, but bizarrely, Mark refused to let the investigators forensically examine her apartment first. Eventually, Mark was talked around, and when investigators entered, they found a bizarre clue, or perhaps a bizarre missing clue. Inside, there was no indication that Susan had voluntarily run away to start a new life as many had suggested. She had left behind her purse, keys, pagers, medication, and all other personal belongings. She had also left behind her son David, who she was incredibly devoted to. There was one clue, or lack of clue, that intrigued investigators though. On Susan's wall calendar, the month of July had been crudely ripped away. Had Susan ripped the paper away intentionally to hide an appointment or an event, or had someone else done this to hide evidence? James Ridgway, who had worked closely with Susan, believes that she may have OD'd and that somebody disposed of her body. Others point to her estranged husband Mark. Mark did refuse to let investigators forensically examine her apartment at first. However, the Nutley Police Department has not officially named him a suspect in Susan's disappearance. Another theory is that the Russian mob, quote-unquote, took care of Susan due to her article exposing their alleged trafficking ring in New York City, although there has been no solid evidence to back up this theory. Another theory is that the bizarre vampire cult clubgoers had something to do with Susan's disappearance. Again, there's not much substance behind this theory. It is merely a sensationalist headline used to get eyes on the case. In the months after Susan disappeared, her friend, Melissa Hines, claims to have seen her standing next to a black car. According to Melissa, when she tried to speak to her, the woman got into the car with the men she was with, and the car drove off. The driver of the car was eventually tracked down, but he was unable to say for certain whether the woman with him that day was Susan. During the initial investigation, the Nutley Police Department searched through the records of the payphones that Susan had apparently used and found no outgoing calls from the morning of her disappearance. Had Mark gotten his wires crossed, or was he giving the police a fake story? As mentioned, the police have not named him a suspect, and there are few suspects in this case. There is one other person I'd like to mention, and that is Billy Walker, an ex-boyfriend of Susan's. According to one of Susan's other ex-boyfriends, Billy was known to stalk her, but it is unclear whether he has ever been looked at in regards to Susan's disappearance. In 2020, Susan's brother sued the Nutley Police Department to obtain the original case files in his sister's disappearance and won. The judge ruled in his favor, and he is now in possession of the case files. Whether these case files will ever be released remains to be seen, but it is a step in the right direction for Susan's case. With the mumblings of the mafia and vampire cults, Susan's family and her son David are left amongst the chaos. Her family is still desperately looking for answers, with June 16, 2025 marking the 29th anniversary of her disappearance. Susan Walsh is described as a white female with bleached blonde hair, blue eyes, 5 foot 6 inches tall, and 110 pounds. She suffers from bipolar disorder and left her medication behind when she disappeared. She is also known to use Xanax and other substances, as well as smoke cigarettes. Susan has a scar on her right wrist and may be suffering from ulcers, bronchitis, and emphysema. Anyone with information is asked to contact the Nutley Police Department at 973-284-4940, quoting the case number 0716.